April 15, 1945, 400 hours. Outside the village of Ebringen, just 6 miles south of Freiburg, the pre-dawn fog rolled low through the Black Forest foothills. The ruins of a stone farmhouse sat half swallowed by trees and mud, its windows blasted out, roof half collapsed. The only sound was the wind slipping through broken rafters. Inside the ruin, 12 American soldiers waited in the dark. Private Tom Lacey had his back pressed against a cold wall, the muzzle of his M1 carbine resting on his knee. His boots were soaked through. The ground stank of wet wood, blood, and cordite. He could hear the slow rasp of breath from the corporal beside him, could feel the tension vibrating through the men like electricity. No one spoke. They were outnumbered more than 40-1. And the Germans were coming. At 4:17 it began. At first it sounded like wind moving through the treetops. Then it sharpened, boots crushing dead leaves, the slap of webbing and canteens, the metallic clack of rifles slung and shifted. Lacey held his breath. Through a gap in the stone wall he saw them. Shadows at first, then outlines, helmets, rifles, whole squads of Wehrmacht infantry, file after file, moving with the mechanical precision of men who believed they would overwhelm whatever stood in front of them. More than 500 of them. Lacey's hands clenched his weapon tighter. 12 Americans. 1 ruined farmhouse. 500 Germans. He felt the fear rising in his throat, but then, just as the first enemy scout stepped past the tree line, Sergeant Jack Murdoch gave the signal, a low whistle like a bird call. And the farmhouse erupted. The bar thundered from the second-floor window, spitting .3006 down the slope. A pair of M1 Garands opened up from behind sandbags by the broken wall. Muzzle flashes lit the ruin like strobe lights. Germans dropped in the first 10 seconds, staggered by the sudden, surgical fury. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not this kind. The lead German squad scattered into the underbrush, some returning fire wildly, others diving flat into the muck. But Murdoch didn't stop. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, yelling over the gunfire, "Pick your targets, make every round count." Lacey fired 2 quick bursts, dropped behind the wall, reloaded. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding over the rifle fire. Corporal Davis shouted from the upstairs floor, "They've got an MG setting up on the left." Murdoch didn't even hesitate. "Briggs, frag out." A single grenade arced from the shattered window, and seconds later the forest edge lit with a flash. Screams echoed. The MG didn't fire. But the Germans kept coming. More squads fanned out through the tree line, probing for flanks, testing the defenses. They fired bursts through the fog, peppering the farmhouse with splinters and lead. Lacey ducked as a chunk of stone exploded above his head. Shards cut through his helmet cover. "How many?" he called out. Davis answered, "Too many to count." Murdoch snarled, "Doesn't matter, we hold." And they did. For 15 minutes the 12 men held the ridge, then 30, then an hour. Ammo ran low, hands shook, throats burned from shouting and smoke, but the farmhouse didn't fall. Because every man inside knew. There was no fallback. There was no second line. They were the line. The radio had gone dead an hour ago. Reinforcements were supposed to arrive by 500. It was now 5:26. And they were still alone. From a ridge 300 meters north, Oberleutnant Eugen Wessel of the 198th Infantry Division watched through binoculars, disbelief on his face. 12 men, he muttered. "It can't be more than 12. A sergeant beside him said, "Shall I order a flanking maneuver?" Wessel didn't answer immediately. He watched as another German squad advanced, only to be cut down in a flash of rifle fire from the upper window. One man was flung backwards by a single chest shot. Another dropped before he could even raise his MP-40. Wessel had commanded units through Normandy, the Huichin Forest, and the Siegfried Line, but never, not once, had he seen this kind of resistance from a force so small. It wasn't just their firepower. It was their calm, their precision. "Not yet," he said. "I want to know who the hell we're fighting first." Back inside the farmhouse, Murdoch crouched by the fireplace, flipping open a map smeared with dirt and blood. Lacey knelt beside him, reloading a fresh clip into his carbine. "We're not gonna hold much longer," Lacey said. "We're running dry." Murdoch didn't look up. "Then we shoot slower. They've got flak support down the hill. If they bring that up, they won't get the chance." Murdoch looked him square in the eyes. His voice was steady, controlled. "This ain't about holding forever. It's about holding long enough." He reached for the flare gun from his belt, loaded it. "Pop this if we go down. Let 'em know where the bodies are." Lacey blinked. "You think it'll come to that?" Murdoch didn't answer. By 600, the Germans had encircled the ridge. Mortars opened up. Shells crashed into the trees behind the farmhouse, shattering branches, throwing mud and smoke into the air. One round landed just short of the south wall, blasting a hole into the structure. Lacey was flung backward, ears ringing. He scrambled up, blood trickling from one temple. Davis pulled him behind a beam. "Stay down." Another mortar hit. The second floor collapsed in one corner. "Murdoch," Lacey shouted, "we're falling apart." But then from far beyond the tree line came a sound, low, rhythmic, mechanical. Engines. American engines. Half-drags drugs. And the shrill scream of .50 cals bursting through the fog. Murdoch stood in the doorway, blood running down his arm, his Thompson hanging at his side. About damn time. Germans scattered as the American reinforcements broke through from the north, armored personnel carriers tearing through brush and mud. Heavy machine guns roared. Infantry poured into the woods, fanning out, sweeping the flanks. The 12 inside the farmhouse didn't cheer. They didn't wave flags. They just slumped against the walls, smoke curling from their weapons, chests heaving. They had done it. Held the line. 12 men. Against 500. The ridge was theirs. And the Germans would never forget it. The trucks pulled in fast, tires clawing at the muddy slope, brakes hissing. Boots hit the ground in a rhythm that was part training, part adrenaline. Dozens of fresh American troops fanned out across the perimeter. Some knelt and opened fire toward the tree line, others scanned for wounded. The fog still clung to the forest, thick and yellow with gunpowder and shattered bark. But inside the ruined farmhouse, no one moved. They'd held for 2 hours, 12 men behind broken walls and sandbagged windows. They had heard the German machine guns chewing through trees. They felt the mortar shells shaking the floor beneath their boots. Every man inside had stared into the barrel of inevitability and refused to blink. Sergeant Murdoch remained by the doorway unmoving, mud caked up to his knees. The bandage on his left forearm was stained through, dark and wet. His Thompson hung low, smoke still curling from the barrel. Behind him, Private Tom Lacey sat slumped against a beam, eyes blinking slowly, his fingers still wrapped around the grip of his carbine. No one was speaking. Not yet. The silence wasn't peace. It was the stunned stillness of men who had passed through something impossible and now couldn't quite believe they were still breathing. A young lieutenant from the reinforcing company stepped inside, ducking low under a collapsed beam. He looked around in disbelief. "Jesus, you're the ones that held this." No one answered. Murdoch glanced up at him. "Where the hell have you been?" The lieutenant flushed. "Our trucks got stuck 2 miles north. Bridge was blown." He looked down at a row of German bodies still cooling in the mud outside the window. "You actually, 12 of you." 13, Murdoch muttered. "Smith bled out 10 minutes before you got here." Outside, the cleanup began. The incoming company pushed through the tree line, clearing out remaining German stragglers. The fight was over for now. But the men in the farmhouse didn't celebrate. They didn't smile. They just sat in what was left of their world and breathed in the silence. Word spread fast. By the next day, across the battalion, across the regiment, the story had started to take shape. 12 Americans, 500 Germans. The numbers traveled faster than the facts. No one knew how accurate they were, but the numbers didn't need to be exact. The story was already bigger than that. In a field command post 2 miles back, a colonel paced behind a folding table strewn with field maps and ration tins. 12 men, he repeated, holding off a full German company until our trucks made it through. Jesus, I thought we lost that position. Sir, said his aide, intelligence believes they were part of a reinforced battalion, not just line infantry, possibly SS elements in the second wave. The colonel stopped pacing, his voice dropped. They held against SS. Appears so, sir. The colonel didn't respond right away. Finally, he muttered, I want names, all 12. A runner was dispatched, a note scribbled and tucked into a waterproof pouch. It reached the battered farmhouse just after dusk. The sky was streaked with artillery smoke and the low buzz of fighter planes returning from the east. Private Lacey was dozing against the collapsed wall when the paper was passed to Murdoch. He unfolded it without comment, read the message, and then burned it with a match. Lacey blinked. What was it? Command wants our names. Lacey raised an eyebrow. What for? Murdoch exhaled slow. For the story. But Lacey didn't smile. We're not a story, we're a mess. Murdoch didn't answer. In the German lines, Oberleutnant Eugen Wessel sat beneath a canvas tent lit by a single lantern. His field glasses were still around his neck. He hadn't taken them off since the ridge, not even during the retreat. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what he'd seen. He didn't need to. He'd watched one position absorb his entire advance, then stop it cold. 500 men, nearly 2 full companies, gone. Wessel's superior officer, Hauptmann Keller, entered the tent carrying a canteen. You're still sulking, he said flatly. They got lucky. Wessel didn't look at him. You call that luck? They had the high ground, probably pre-sighted emplacements, lucky positioning. No, Wessel said. It wasn't positioning, it was precision. They didn't waste a shot. We tried flanking, they adjusted. We tried suppressing, they baited our machine guns into crossfire. That wasn't luck. Keller scoffed. You sound like a man who wants to write them a medal. Wessel finally looked at him. I sound like a man who doesn't want to send the next 500 into the same meat grinder without understanding what they're facing. Keller poured water into a tin cup and handed it to him. It was a farmhouse. They'll blow it off the ridge tomorrow and no one will remember it happened. But Wessel knew better. In the mud-soaked calm that followed the battle, the Americans pulled the dead into shallow graves behind the ridge. Smith's body was wrapped in a poncho and buried with his dog tags laid carefully on top. Murdoch stood over the grave for a long time after the others walked away. Lacey approached slowly. You want to say anything? Murdoch shook his head. He already knew. A convoy passed down the main road that evening, trucks headed east, loaded with fresh troops, ammo, fuel. One jeep slowed as it passed the farmhouse. A captain in the passenger seat leaned out, staring at the ruined structure and the dozen men outside it. You the ones from the ridge, he called. Murdoch nodded once. The captain gave a small, disbelieving laugh. Hell of a thing. Then the jeep rolled on, vanishing into the mist and exhaust. But the story didn't vanish. It spread from mess tent to battalion HQ, from field hospitals to rear-echelon radio operators. It grew in the telling. Some said it was 600 Germans. Others swore the Americans only had a single machine gun between them. Some whispered that German prisoners had refused to charge the farmhouse after seeing the first two waves get cut down. None of it was quite true, and none of it mattered. Because the core of it was real. 12 Americans had held a position no one should have held and lived to tell about it. In a briefing days later, a general from Army Group G asked his staff, "Do we have confirmation on that story from Ebringen?" An aide replied, "We have names, sir, and after-action reports, it checks out." The general nodded. "Then use it. Morale's a damn fragile thing right now. Let the men hear it." Lacey never heard the end of it. A week later, they were rotated north towards Stuttgart, part of the final push across the southern flank. The farmhouse was behind them, Smith's grave, the blood and smoke. But every town they passed through, someone said it. "You the ones from Ebringen?" And all Lacey could ever say was, "Yeah." He never believed they were heroes. He remembered trembling hands and missed shots and the terror in his throat when the first mortar hit the floorboards. He remembered watching Davis drag their last wounded man behind a shattered beam, blood soaking through his trousers, muttering prayers between clenched teeth. But they had held. 12 of them. And to the enemy who had watched it from the trees, it hadn't looked like desperation. It had looked like something else entirely. Something that made even 500 men pause before moving forward again. The next morning, they moved out. A new company rolled into the ridge, fresh faces, clean helmets, bright-eyed and ready. Some of them had heard the story already. One kid, Thompson, barely out of high school, grinned wide as he stepped into the old farmhouse and traced a finger along the cracked wall where Lacey had knelt for hours. "This where it happened?" He asked no one in particular. Murdoch was already walking, helmet low, rucksack heavy, boots splashing through the churned-up mud of the road south. He didn't answer. He hadn't said much since they left the ridge. None of them had. They marched through villages reduced to rubble, past barns still smoking, past trees snapped like toothpicks from artillery blasts. In places, the Germans had left nothing but silence, the kind that stuck to your boots. By mid-afternoon, they passed a farmhouse burned flat to its foundation, nothing left but ash and bones. A sign in the mud read, "MINEN." One of the engineers waved them to the ditch, and the column shifted around it. Lacey was near the rear of the file, his carbine slung tight, his thoughts drifting. He kept thinking about Smith, the way his mouth had moved even after the bleeding had stopped. Like he had one more thing to say but ran out of time to say it. Up ahead, Murdoch raised a fist. The column stopped. Just past the tree line, a second farmhouse stood, almost a mirror of the one they'd fought in. Same crumbling stone walls, same sagging roof, same gaping windows watching the road like blind eyes. "Looks abandoned," someone whispered. Murdoch's hand went up again. "Recon sweep now." Lacey, Davis, and two others moved in. Boots soft in the mud, rifles up, breath shallow. No birds, no rustling. Just that feeling, the pressure behind the ribs that said something wasn't right. They cleared the first room. Empty. Second room, a mattress on the floor, an old enamel basin with blood dried black in the bottom. Upstairs, broken glass. No signs of movement. But it wasn't the silence that unsettled Lacey. It was the heat still hanging in the house. Someone had been there. Recently. They regrouped outside. Murdoch took one look at the tracks in the road, dozens of boot prints leading east, and made the call. They were here this morning. Move, now. They picked up the pace. Reinforcements were expected to meet them at a crossroad 3 kilometers south. But that was theory. And theory didn't hold up when 500 Germans decided to change direction. In the forest east of their line, Oberleutnant Eugen Wessel knelt in the dirt beside a map, flanked by 2 field radio operators and a squad leader with mud up to his belt. "The Americans moved on the Ebringen Road," the squad leader said. Wessel nodded. "Do we know how many?" Not yet, company-sized maybe less. Wessel's eyes narrowed. The ones from the ridge. Could be. He closed the map. We'll adjust, cut them off at the crossroads. This time they would do it differently. No direct charge. No pushing into a prepared kill zone. Wessel had spent 2 nights studying the way those 12 men had held. He'd read the debriefs from survivors. He'd mapped the overlapping fields of fire, the tight reload rhythms, the way the Americans had never revealed all their positions at once. It wasn't just firepower, it was discipline. He would not let discipline beat him again. The Americans reached the crossroads by dusk. No reinforcements, no trucks, just silence. Murdoch didn't hesitate. Set perimeter, dig in. The ground was harder here, rocky, roots thick beneath the surface. They used knives and entrenching tools, cursed at the stones, worked until their hands were raw. Lacey built a foxhole just off the road behind a fallen pine. Davis stacked rocks for a firing perch. Someone rigged a tripwire behind the tree line with a frag grenade clipped to it. They weren't waiting to be surprised again. By 2100, the first shot cracked through the trees. Just one. Then silence. Then 6 more. The line held still, every man pressing his face to the stock of his rifle, scanning shadows. Nothing moved. Then came the second volley, this one closer. 5 rounds, then a long pause, then 3 more, staggered, probing. American training said you never fired without target confirmation. This was something else. Someone was watching, measuring. Davis whispered, "They're feeling us out." Lacey nodded, like they're learning. And he was right. Wessel had ordered fire in patterns designed not to kill but to map the return fire. Every time a shot came from the American line, a spotter marked it. By midnight, he had a grid. But what he didn't know was that Murdoch had heard the change too. "This isn't a charge," he told Lacey, crouched beside a rusted road sign. "It's a trap. They're trying to draw us out." "So what do we do?" Murdoch stared into the trees, eyes unreadable. "We wait." At 200, a German flare lit the sky, green, drifting, hissing. And from the south, boots began to move. Not fast, not charging. Just a steady advance, squads fanning through the trees, quiet, professional. Lacey shifted, heart thudding. These weren't green troops. When the first fire team broke the tree line, Murdoch whispered, "Now." 3 foxholes opened up in unison. Muzzle flashes lit the night. Germans dropped. Return fire cracked the air. And then nothing. No charge, no second wave. They were testing again. The silence stretched for almost an hour. Then from the east, movement. A second squad flanking. Garand fire met them at the corner of the fence line. Another squad from the north, cut down by the second team. Every attempt met steel. Every flank found a wall. By 4:30, Wessel ordered a fallback, not because he'd lost too many, but because he hadn't gained a single inch. Again. In the morning light, the crossroads held. The Americans, grim-faced and bleeding, began picking up shell casings from the grass. A jeep finally arrived. A single officer stepped out and looked around. "Christ, they hit you again." Murdoch said nothing. Davis leaned on his rifle. "We held." The officer nodded slowly. "Looks like you did." In the German camp, Wessel stared at his notes in silence. 2 engagements, 2 failures. And both times, he had underestimated not just the firepower, but the will. It wasn't 12 men anymore. It was whoever carried the memory of that ridge. And that was a number he couldn't count. The crossroads never had a name, at least not one any of them could pronounce. Just a cluster of flattened trees, a farmhouse with no roof, and a gravel road that forked like a decision no one wanted to make. They left it behind 2 days later, ordered north toward Riegel. Another town, another unknown, another line to hold. But something was different now. Other companies saluted when they passed. Mechanics offered cigarettes. Officers who didn't know their names nodded in silence. The story had taken root. 12 men, a ridge, 500 Germans, and then again at the crossroads. The numbers were wrong, inflated, twisted in the retelling, but no one cared. It wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was what they had proven. That holding wasn't about how many were in the trench, but how long you were willing to stay there. Private Tom Lacey had stopped trying to explain it. When a captain asked him what happened at Ebringen, he just said, "We stayed where we were told." That seemed to satisfy them. Sergeant Murdoch said even less. He walked like a man carrying a coffin on his back, every step deliberate. His men watched him for cues, not because he barked orders, but because when the shelling started, he was the only one who didn't flinch. They reached Riegel before dawn. The town was half rubble, but there were civilians still moving, old men, women, children, faces pinched by hunger and fear. There were no smiles. The war was etched into the mortar of every wall, the soot of every chimney. Murdoch took one look at the map, at the way the town split along a shallow river, and started laying out sectors. "North side's open," he said. "That's where they'll come." Davis asked, "How do you know?" "Because that's what I do." They set positions along a half-broken stone bridge and 2 alleys feeding into it. Foxholes weren't possible here, too much concrete. They used doors, furniture, anything they could drag into place. By noon, artillery echoed to the northeast. And by nightfall, a runner arrived with a message from battalion. German armor had been spotted 5 clicks out, infantry massing behind it. A full push. It was the same 198th Infantry Division, Wessel's division. They were coming again. And this time, Wessel wasn't looking to probe or test. He was coming to break something. Lacey leaned against a windowsill, checking his ammo count. He was down to 6 clips. His carbine was clean, oiled, ready, but his body was. His knees ached. His palms were blistered. The skin under his helmet itched with weeks of sweat and dirt. Murdoch passed behind him, dragging sandbags across the floor. "You think they'll hit hard?" Lacey asked. Murdoch didn't stop. "I think they'll hit smart." And he was right. At 2200, the town lights died, not from artillery, from sabotage. Someone had cut the lines. Everything turned to shadow. Then came the flares, dozens of them launched high, drifting slowly, lighting Riegel in a sickly green glow. And then the first shells landed. Not on the bridge, on the rooftops behind it. It wasn't random. They weren't shelling blindly. They were shelling to herd, to push the Americans forward out of cover. "Don't move," Murdoch shouted even as the second wave hit. "Stay down." One building collapsed entirely, a wooden house near the bakery. The men in it scrambled out, coughing, one of them dragging another with blood streaming from his thigh. From the fog, the Germans advanced, not in a wave, in columns. Squads with overlapping fire clearing buildings room by room. It wasn't a charge. It was methodical, mechanical, like a machine grinding through rubble. Davis opened fire from the corner of a bell tower, his gear end flashing in clean bursts. Lacey fired from the alley, dropping 2 figures who darted between shadows. The town turned into a labyrinth of sound, shots echoing off stone, boots pounding up stairwells, screams muffled behind closed doors. At 2330, Wessel stood at the edge of town with a field radio in one hand and a flare gun in the other. He had eyes on the bridge, on the crossfire, on the angles. He had studied the farmhouse, studied the crossroads. Tonight he was applying the lesson. But inside the church, Murdoch was watching too. He moved between positions like a man already ghosted, giving quick corrections, swapping ammo between squads, dragging wounded into cover. He didn't need to ask how many were down. He could feel it. At one point, a private tried to leave his post. just 15 feet back toward a safer doorway. Murdoch blocked him with one hand. "We don't fall back," he said. "Not now." The private swallowed hard. "They're in the next building, Sarge." "I know. They're right there." Murdoch met his eyes. "So are we." And the man went back to his post. Lacey caught a glimpse of the German squad moving through the orchard behind the bakery, flanking. He fired 3 rounds, hit one, saw the rest vanish into the smoke. "Left flank's folding," he shouted. Murdoch was already moving. He grabbed 2 men and ran toward the gap, rifles ready. They weren't plugging holes. They were making the Germans hesitate, buying minutes. And they did, minute by minute, inch by inch. Wessel's attack stalled. He could feel it in the pace of the reports, the tone of the radio calls. They were advancing, yes, but slower than planned. He cursed under his breath. Every time he tried to collapse one sector, another one lit up, like fire shifting with the wind. This wasn't luck. It was familiar. He turned to his sergeant. "Is it them again?" "Sorry." "The Americans from Ebringen, the ones from the ridge." The sergeant didn't answer. Because they both knew. At 100, American reinforcements finally broke through from the west, 2 companies in trucks with armor support. The Germans, stretched thin and without armor of their own, began pulling back under the cover of smoke. By 200, the town fell silent. And the bridge still stood. When the colonel arrived, he found Murdoch sitting on a stoop with a cigarette burned almost to the filter. Lacey was asleep beside a sandbag wall. Davis was digging a fresh position, even though the fight was over. The colonel said, "We expected Rigel to fall." Murdoch said nothing. "You held it." Murdoch looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. "We were told to." The colonel didn't argue. 3 days later, Oberleutnant Wessel received new orders: pull back to Freiburg. Defensive operations only. No more advances. He packed his kit in silence. On the table beside him, a folded report read simply, "Engaged American resistance at Rigel. No forward progress. Losses unsustainable." He looked at the last line for a long time. And then, without a word, he burned the page. The last German town they reached was little more than a crossroads with 2 churches and a train station. The tracks were twisted from an air raid a week earlier. Most of the houses had no windows. The people who lived there stared at the column of American infantry like they were ghosts, not conquerors, not even enemies, just men who didn't look away. It was late April now. The war was bleeding out. The 12 were down to 9. Smith had died at Ebringen, Riley lost at Rigel. Pike vanished during a night patrol and never came back. There were no medals yet, no citations, only stories. In the rear lines, everyone knew the Ridge team. That's what they called them now. Even new recruits asked, "Are you one of the guys from Ebringen?" Lacey had stopped answering. Murdoch never had. When they crossed the Danube, it was under sunlight. No artillery, no shots, just the weight of boots over bridges and the crackling voices on radios asking for positions, updates, surrender terms. The war was almost over. But there was still killing. They moved into the outskirts of a village called Thalkirchen, 6 miles south of Munich. Intelligence said a fanatical Waffen-SS detachment had barricaded the church and 2 schoolhouses. The locals said they'd heard executions at night, suspected deserters, resistance collaborators. It didn't matter. Orders were simple: take the village. Murdoch studied the map under the shade of a willow tree. His squad crouched around him, rifles stacked in a loose pyramid, steam rising from their gear in the cool morning. Lacey still carried the same carbine he'd used at the ridge. It rattled slightly now when he moved. He stopped trying to fix it. "Same setup," Murdoch said. "Bridge here, they'll expect armor. We're not giving it to them." Davis ran a hand down his face. They'll shoot civilians. They already have. No one asked why they were being sent. There were full battalions nearby, tank companies, reinforced infantry groups, but that wasn't the point. It was about who you trusted with things that shouldn't fail. So they went. Through the fields low and fast. No formations, just movement, the kind born from instinct, not doctrine. Murdoch led them across the river where a stone culvert ran under the road. They emerged into a cabbage field, crawled up behind a low brick wall and waited. A single shot cracked the silence. Then another. Then the whole line opened up. Lacey hugged the dirt as splinters flew past his head. The wall shook behind him. From the second schoolhouse, an MG-42 stitched the field with fire. The ground around him danced with shrapnel. Someone screamed, short and sharp, then went silent. He didn't look to see who. Murdoch popped smoke. Davis lobbed 2 grenades at the left flank, one bouncing off a gutter before exploding in a flash of stone and debris. Lacey took the moment and ran 20 feet across open space to a cellar door, bullets nipping at his boots. They fought through windows, room to room. The school smelled like chalk, gun oil, and old fear. It took 41 minutes. When it was over, the SS were gone. Not all dead, some had run, some surrendered, but the position was cleared. Thalkirchen was taken. No one cheered. In the corner of one classroom, a crucifix lay half-shattered beside a chalkboard, still scrawled with a child's drawing. Lacey stared at it for a long time before sitting down in the nearest desk, his legs shaking. Murdoch stood in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe, smoking. His sleeve was torn. Blood was soaking slowly through the side of his shirt. "Bandage that," Davis said, approaching. Murdoch didn't answer. 2 days later, Germany surrendered. The rifles were still hot when the papers were signed. Not everyone stopped shooting right away. There were men too deep into the fire to hear peace when it arrived. It took time. But for the 12, the 9, it was over. They were pulled back behind the lines. No one told them why, just orders, a truck, a crate of sea rations, a barn near Ulm with a stove and a caved-in roof. 3 days in, an officer arrived with a clipboard. He had questions. Wanted to confirm positions, get statements, build a proper record. It was all very official. Murdoch gave short answers. Lacey gave none. Finally, the officer asked, "Do you know your story is spreading across Europe?" Murdoch shrugged. "It's not a story, it's a fight." The officer smiled like he understood, but he didn't. He left the next day. Years passed. Lacey returned to Ohio, married a nurse, built furniture, kept the carbine in the attic where it wouldn't rattle anymore. Murdoch never came back. No one knew where he went. There were rumors: Argentina, a cabin in Maine, a fishing boat out of San Pedro. No one could prove any of them. Some men vanish when the war ends because they were never really built for anything else. Every Veterans Day, a small article ran in local papers about the stand at Ebringen. It never used names, just the headline. 12 Americans held the line against 500. Most people read it over coffee, maybe told their kids, then moved on. But somewhere in Bavaria, a plaque was placed near a broken stone wall. The locals restored the farmhouse, planted flowers, hung an American flag beside the German one. They didn't care about the numbers. They remembered the sound. The sound of 12 rifles firing through the mist, again and again, until the ridge held. Until the war changed direction. Until 500 men stopped advancing and started wondering who exactly they were fighting, and why those 12 refused to move.